a cowboy appeared before St. Peter at the pearly gates.
"Have you ever done anything of particular merit?"
St. Peter asked.
"Well, I can think of one thing,"
the cowboy offered.
"On a trip to the Black Hills out in South Dakota, I came upon a gang of bikers who were threatening a young woman. I directed them to leave her alone, but they wouldn't listen. So I approached the largest and most tattooed biker and smacked him in the face. Kicked his bike over, ripped out his nose ring, and threw it on the ground. Then I yelled, 'Now back off or I'll kick the out of all of you.'"
St. Peter was impressed.
"When did this happen?"
The cowboy replied,
"Couple of minutes ago."
A man with a winking problem is applying for a position as a sales representative for a large firm. The interviewer looks over his papers and says,
"This is phenomenal. You've graduated from the best schools, your recommendations are wonderful, and your experience is unparalleled. Normally, we'd hire you without a second thought. However, a sales representative has a highly visible position, and we're afraid that your constant winking will scare off potential customers. I'm sorry, we can't hire you."
"But wait," he says, "if I take 2 aspirin, I'll stop winking."
"Great, show me,"
replies the interviewer. The applicant reaches into his pocket and begins pulling out all sorts of condoms. Red condoms, blue condoms, ribbed condoms, flavored condoms. Finally, at the bottom, he finds a packet of aspirin. He tears it open, swallows the pills, and stops winking.
"Well,"
says the interviewer,
"that's all well and good. But this is a respectable company, and we will not have our employees womanizing all over the country."
"Womanizing? What do you mean? I'm a happily married man," he replies.
"Well then, how do you explain all these condoms?"
asks the interviewer. "Oh, that," he sighs. "Have you ever walked into a pharmacy winking and asked for aspirin?" A Russian scientist and a Czech scientist spend their lives studying grizzly bears. Each year, they petition their respective governments to allow them to go to Yellowstone Park to study the bears. Finally, their request is granted, and they immediately fly to the United States to visit Yellowstone Park. When they report to the ranger station, they are told that it is the grizzly mating season and it is too dangerous to study the animals. The scientists plead that this is their only chance, and finally the ranger gives in. The Russian and the Czech are given cell phones and are told to report in every day. For several days, the scientists call in as requested. Then, on the 4th day, there is no phone call. The rangers mount a search party and find the camp completely ravaged, with no sign of the missing men. They find bear tracks and follow the trail of a male and female bear. Eventually, they locate the female bear and decided they must put the animal down to find out if she has eaten the scientists. When they open the stomach, they find the remains of the Russian scientist. One ranger turns to the other and says,
"You know what this means, don't you?"
The other ranger responds, "Of course I do. The check is in the mail." John works hard for his living, so his wife decides that he deserves a special treat for his birthday. One night, she blindfolds him and takes him to a local strip club. The doorman at the club greets them and says,
"Hey John, how are you doing?"
His wife thinks this is a little strange. Once inside, John's wife removes the blindfold and asks him if he's ever been to this club before.
"Oh no," says John. "He's one of those security guys I meet on my business trips."
After they're seated, a waitress asks John if he'd like his usual and brings over a Budweiser. His wife is becoming increasingly uncomfortable and asks,
"How did she know that you drink Budweiser?"
"Oh, I recognize her. She's the waitress at the bar around the corner from work. I always drop in there and have a bud on Fridays," replies John. Next, a stripper comes over to their table, throws her arms around John and says,
"Hi, Johnny. Won't your usual table dance?
John's wife, now furious, grabs her purse and storms out of the club. John follows her and spots her getting into a cab. Before she can slam the door, he jumps in beside her. John tries desperately to explain how the stripper must have mistaken him for someone else. But his wife is having none of it. She is screaming at him at the top of her lungs, calling him every name in the book. Just then, the cabbie turns around and says,
"Geez, John. You picked up a real piece of work this time."
Cinderella was now 75 years old. After a fulfilling life with the now passed away prince, she sat happily upon her rocking chair, watching the world go by from her front porch, with a cat named Alan for companionship. One sunny afternoon, out of nowhere, appeared the fairy godmother. Cinderella said,
Fairy godmother, what are you doing here after all these years?
The fairy godmother replied,
Well, Cinderella, as you have lived a good and wholesome life since we last met, I have decided to grant you 3 wishes. Is there anything for which your heart still yearns?
Cinderella was overjoyed, and after some thoughtful consideration, almost under her breath, she uttered her first wish.
I wish I was wealthy beyond comprehension.
Instantly, her rocking chair was turned into solid gold. Cinderella was stunned. Alan, her old faithful cat, jumped off her lap and scampered to the edge of the porch, quivering with fear. Cinderella said,
Oh, thank you, fairy godmother.
The fairy godmother replied,
It's the least I can do. What does your heart desire for your second wish?
Cinderella looked down at her frail body and said,
I wish I were young and full of the beauty of youth again.
At once, her wish became reality, and her beautiful, youthful visage returned. Cinderella felt stirrings inside her that had been dormant for years, and long-forgotten vigor and vitality began to course through her very soul. Then the fairy godmother again spoke.
You have one more wish. What will you have?
Cinderella looked over to the frightened cat in the corner and said,
I wish you to transform Alan, my old cat, into a beautiful and handsome young man.
Magically, Alan suddenly underwent a fundamental change in his biological makeup. That, when complete, he stood before her, a boy so beautiful, the likes of which neither she nor the world had ever seen. The fairy godmother again spoke.
Congratulations, Cinderella. Enjoy your new life.
And with a blazing shock of bright blue electricity, she was gone. For a few eerie moments, Alan and Cinderella looked into each other's eyes. Cinderella sat breathless, gazing at the most stunningly perfect boy she had ever seen. Then, Alan walked over to Cinderella, who sat transfixed in a rocking chair, and held her close in his strong, youthful arms. He leaned in close to her ear, whispered, blowing her golden hair with his warm breath. I bet you regret having me neutered now, don't you? A bear, a moose, a fox, and a snail are playing cards around a table. Suddenly, the bear lets out a faint roar and says,
Guys, I'm hungry. Could someone go buy some chips or something?
The moose shakes his head and nods towards the fox. The fox irritatingly slams his little paw on the table and mutters,
Why me? Why can't the moose do it?
The snail bravely interrupts the conversation before it gets out of hand and says,
Guys, there's no reason to fight. I'll go.
The bear smiles a little and hands the snail a few rolled up dollars from his pocket.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. While you're at it, buy something to drink, will ya?
The snail winks, grabs the money, and briskly makes his way out the door. Half an hour goes by, then an hour, then an hour and a half. Finally, the bear snaps, drops his cards to the floor, and yells,
Hey, you know what? I think that little bugger took the money and just left.
A small yet fierce scream then comes from near the front door.
If you're gonna start talking smack about me, I'm just gonna turn around and come back.
Upon arriving home, a husband is met at the door by his sobbing wife. Tearfully, she explains,
It's the pharmacist. He insulted me terribly this morning on the phone.
Immediately, the husband drives downtown to confront the pharmacist and demand an apology. Before he could say more than a few words, the pharmacist tells him,
Now, just a minute. Please listen to my side of it. This morning, the alarm failed to go off, so I was late getting up. I went without breakfast and hurried out to the car, just to realize that I locked the house with both house and car keys inside. I had to break a window to get my keys. Then, driving a little too fast, I got a speeding ticket. Later, about 3 blocks from the store, I had a flat tire. When I got to the store, there was a bunch of people waiting for me to open up. I opened and started waiting on these people, and all the time, the darn phone was ringing off the hook.
He continues,
Then I had to break a roll of nickels against the cash register drawer to make change, and they spilled all over the floor. I got down on my hands and knees to pick up the nickels, and the phone was still ringing. When I came back up, I cracked my head on the open cash drawer, which made me stagger back against the showcase with a bunch of perfume bottles on it. All of them hit the floor and broke. Meanwhile, the phone is still ringing with no let-up. So I finally got to answer it. It was your wife. She wanted to know how to use a rectal thermometer. Honest, mister, all I did was tell her.
One day, a young man takes a trip out west and comes across a little Native American village. He thinks, what the heck, I might as well stop and look around. One of the native women notices the man and tells him he should visit the chief. She tells him the chief has the longest and best memory in the world. So the man visits the chief and says, I hear you have the greatest memory in the world. The chief replies,
Yes, I do. I can remember every single detail of my entire life.
The man figures he should test this, so he asks the chief, What did you have for breakfast on May the 15th, 1958? After stopping to think for a second, the chief answers,
I had 2 eggs.
Satisfied, the man says goodbye to the chief and eventually leaves the village. 20 years later, the man takes another trip out west and comes across the same village again. He's amazed when he sees the chief still alive after all these years. The man decides to stop and say hello, so he raises his hand and says, How? The chief replies,
Fried.